Hi, everyone. I see that people are still joining, so welcome, and we'll start in a few minutes. We're just going to leave a couple more minutes to let people who are finishing up lunch perhaps join our meeting.
It looks like people have stopped chiming in. So, Edith, ready to get started?
Yes, let's get going.
Great. I can say a couple of opening remarks. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody who's attending to attending this webinar. Thank you for paying attention to this and participating and coming to this particular webinar. And hopefully, a lot of you have been following along, and so this is somewhat not completely new, and we'll fill in some blanks for you. So it's been a lot of work been done over the last couple of months so far by our team, and we're wrapping up the first phase, the technical phase of inputs into the modeling, and about to go into the modeling with our contractor, which we'll explain in more detail. And so our team's gonna share with you all the great work that's been done so far and bring you up to speed and then prepare you for the next phase of the Oregon State Energy Strategy, which is going into the policy discussions and the development of recommendations, being informed by the modeling work and the technical work that we've been doing up to this point. So I think it's pretty interesting. And we've got a little presentation for you to walk through all of that. And we'll have a lot of time for questions and answers at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to Edith. Oh, next slide. Before we do that, I wanted to just share with you we have this slide probably in most of our presentations, but I wanted to share with you our mission, which I think is particularly cogent and particularly important for this process. And I'm actually going to read it because I think it's important. And it's the Oregon Department of Energy helps Oregonians make informed decisions and maintain resilient and affordable energy system. We advance solutions to shape an equitable clean energy transition, protect the environment and public health, and responsibly balance energy needs and impacts for current and future generations. And that really, to me, is the embodiment of what the Oregon State Energy Strategy is. That's what we're trying to do. So we're doing it in a very particular way, but it's towards this mission and meeting our energy and greenhouse gas goals and that we have from the state that we're be doing in this process. So now with that, I'll turn it over to Edith.
Thanks, Alan. If we go to the next slide. So my name's Edith Bayer. I'm Energy Policy Team Lead at the Oregon Department of Energy, and leading up the work on this project with a fantastic team. So I just have this slide to explain the interface in case you're not familiar or need a refresher on how WebEx works. We've set up this webinar to enable questions and comments to come in through the chat. And so throughout the webinar, we really encourage you to write in your questions. If there are some clarifying questions that we can hit kind of as we go through, we'll keep an eye out for those. And then, as Alan mentioned, we have some time reserved for Q&A at the end. And I also want to emphasize that we have a comment portal that's always open on our website, and we very much welcome comments there too. So if you might be calling in by phone today and not have your hands free or not be able to type in a question today, you're very welcome to send in your question via the comment portal. And as you can see here, our colleague Abby Reeser is here for tech support. So any questions to her email address is below on this slide. If we go to the next slide. So here's a quick summary of what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of what we've been doing this summer and how we've been engaging to inform the technical and modeling work that is going to start shortly. That Alan mentioned. So I'll first talk about the process and then a little bit about what the approach is to the modeling. This is a pretty different exercise than some folks might be used to. And so I just want to talk a little bit about how the whole analysis is being structured. We're then going to talk about the reference scenario, which is kind of the central scenario that we then compare the 5 alternative scenarios to. So we're kind of going to tee those up separately. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. So if we go to the next slide. So we've been very busy this summer, and I'd like to start by talking about our engagement process and how that engagement has informed where we are with the energy strategy so far. So if we go to the next slide, I'd like to begin with the bill, House Bill 3630, which directs the Oregon Department of Energy to develop a comprehensive state energy strategy that identifies pathways to achieve Oregon's energy policy objectives. So there are really 3 main elements of the energy strategy, and the bill emphasizes that the report should include these 3 main elements. So there's engagement to inform all of the analysis and the thinking. The pathways, which is really the technical analysis to look at different ways of achieving those energy policy objectives. And then we'll be developing policy recommendations. And the final report, this is all going to be wrapped up in a final report, which is due to the governor and legislature by November 1st, 2025. If we go to the next slide. So we kicked off the project with the technical analysis, and that's what we'll spend most of today's webinar talking about. I think it's important to emphasize that all of these conversations that we've had over the summer, all of the engagement has been to inform this technical analysis, but ultimately the technical analysis doesn't serve any means by itself. The purpose of the analysis is really to help inform policy discussions. And so the two are really interlinked. And phase 2 of the project, the policy discussions, is going to kick off early next year. And then phase 3 that you see here is drafting the final report. So we will pull together the technical analysis, the recommendations that have come out of the policy discussions, explain how engagement has informed all of this, and it'll be rolled up into that report that's due by November 1st of next year. We go to the next slide. I'm going to start by talking about how we framed the engagement around the technical analysis. So what you see on this slide is the framework that House Bill 3630 provides to guide engagement in the energy strategy. So first, the energy strategy must be informed by, you see this piece on the left, stakeholder perspectives, state laws, policies, and targets relating to energy and greenhouse gas emissions, existing energy and integrated resource plans, energy-related studies and data analysis, and state energy policy objectives. And then there's additional guidance in the bill on the scope of the engagement. And so you can see here, this is just language directly from the bill that we must engage with state agencies, with tribes, and with stakeholders with a diverse range of interests, perspectives, expertise, education, socioeconomic backgrounds, different communities, and different geographic areas of the state. So this slide really represents the boundaries that the bill has given us and some of the direction that we've received to help us structure the engagement. If we go to the next slide, we formed, and this is my fancy animated slide. I don't do this very often, so hopefully it works. We formed several structures to help us meet these engagement guidelines. So if we click once, the steering group is made up of peer agency experts who provide expertise, data, and guidance to ensure that the energy strategy is built on the foundations of existing policies and programs. It includes the Public Utilities Commission, the Department of Environmental Quality, Department of Transportation, Department of Land Conservation and Development, Department of State Lands, Business Oregon, and the Governor's Office. And we've also been in touch with several other agencies on specific aspects of the project to get their views and feedback. And the steering group meets about once a month. The working groups are divided by topic, and they bring together individuals with professional and lived experience in their topic area. And I'll talk a little bit more about the working groups shortly. If we go to the next one, the advisory group was formed to serve as a forum to provide insights, recommendations, and advice to the project team, particularly on topics and issues where there's not broad agreement or where we still have outstanding questions. Advisory group members, there are about 30 members in total, serve as representatives of their organizational and community interests. And both the advisory group and the steering group are structures that are groups that meet approximately once a month to inform the energy strategy as it develops between now. Well, they both started before now, but continue through now and into next year. If we go to the next two engagement opportunities, the listening sessions and public comment portal serve to enable broad public engagement and the opportunity to provide feedback throughout the entire energy strategy development process. So we held a couple of listening sessions earlier in the summer. And in those sessions, we took note of questions and ideas that participants shared. We've used that information along with that gathered from the steering group, the working groups, the advisory group to inform our analysis. So we take the listening sessions very seriously. They're not just to report out, they really are to listen and understand different views. And similarly, public comments that we've received have helped inform our thinking. So the one more point that I'd like to make is that the working group meetings, the advisory group meetings, and the listening sessions are all open to the public with presentations and recordings put up on the website after each meeting. So those are accessible for anybody to listen in. So if we click again, as we held these various meetings over the summer, Odo worked with our consultants at the Clean Energy Transitions Institute to consider comments and suggestions, and to also understand how the model might incorporate comments that we've received. So there's been a bit of a learning process that we've gone through as we've gone through these various meetings and taken questions back to our consultants. And our consultants have helped us synthesize this information to prepare a draft model structure. And so if we click once more, the first priority in the process of framing the modeling was to define the data and key assumptions for the reference scenario, which, as you'll see shortly, is the starting point for how the analysis is structured. If we go to the next slide, I also want to point out that tribal consultation is an important part of our process. We continue our efforts to consult with the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon, as well as incorporate tribal perspectives in our process. For our government-to-government consultation, our director has sent 2 formal letters to each chair of the 9 Oregon tribes. These letters have shared summaries and information, as well as inviting each tribe to decide how they would like to participate in the process with the menu of options, including an invitation to appoint members to our advisory group and offers to meet one-on-one with tribal council or their staff. So in addition, the advisory group has 3 members that bring a tribal perspective. We have the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs Power and Water Enterprises, climate change staff from Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and staff from the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. So as a next step, Odo is working on a 3rd letter to invite consultation with tribes with an invitation to meet and provide a report on the energy strategy development with tribal councils as we begin to plan for that 2nd phase of the project that I mentioned, which is policy engagement. So on the next slide, I promised that I'd talk more about the working groups. So we had 8 working groups in total, each of which addressed a key topic for the energy strategy. So we had a group focused on direct use fuels and industry. And this group focused on natural gas and fuels used in buildings and industry for heat and manufacturing. It did not include fuels used in transportation or for electricity generation. Those were dealt with in another group. We also had a group that focused on electricity generation technologies. And one of the key topics discussed there was the uncertainty around data center load growth. We had a transportation group that included discussion around cars, trucks, buses, aviation, rail, maritime transport, and alternative modes of transportation. So pretty broad, but any way you might take to get from here to there, it was included in that group. Transmission and distribution focused on the network of wires and pipelines that move electricity, natural gas, and other fuels from their source to where they're used. We also talked about buildings and energy used in buildings. We talked about energy efficiency and shifting the time of energy use, which is what load flexibility here refers to. We had an equity and environmental justice group that looked at equity and environmental justice in the modeling and also how additional analysis might be structured to gather insights from the modeling results. And we had a land use and natural resources group, which evaluated land and natural resource availability and how that's framed up in the model. So if you go to the next slide, I want to just show a brief timeline of what we've been up to so you can see it in kind of in this format. So in April, end of April and early June, we signed contracts for our consultants, the Clean Energy Transitions Institute, who are our technical consultants, and Kearns and West, who are our facilitators. And then in June and July, we really dedicated ourselves to preparing for engagement. So that included holding a series of data holder meetings that were really focused on ensuring that we start off the working group meetings, incorporating the best available data and understanding the state energy policy objectives that the model addresses, understanding existing energy and integrated resource plans, and evaluating energy-related studies and data analysis. So these are all requirements of the bill, and we had a series of meetings to understand those pieces better so we'd be well informed when we started our public engagement. And then we spent a lot of time preparing for engagement. So we asked for letters of interest for the advisory group. We defined working group members, also with the help of our sister agencies, and we structured our timeline for the technical analysis of the project. We were very conscious of time since you can see that the contracts were signed a bit later than we expected in the process. And that put us up against some modeling deadlines that we shifted as far as possible into the future without risking project delays that we wouldn't be able to overcome. And so that's part of the reason why we had quite a compressed timeline this summer. So you can see we kicked off public engagement on July 31st. We had a couple of listening sessions, and then we held a series of working group meetings over the next 3 weeks. Over these few months, we also had a couple of steering group meetings and advisory group meetings. And that kind of brings us to today, where we're having this webinar. And one of the things that we'd like to do today is to present to you the draft scenarios that we've framed up based on all of the feedback that we've received. And we're asking for final comments on those alternative scenarios by the end of the day on October 11th. So there's still one more piece before we're to the finish line on the modeling. So if we go to the next slide, So this slide looks really similar to the other one that I showed, except it emphasizes that once we developed that draft reference scenario, we then ran that once again by these various groups and also opened up a period for public comments, and those kind of informed our final change, our final decisions. And we did make some final changes to the key assumptions for the reference scenario based on some of that feedback. And that reference scenario is now available online on our website, so you can take a look at that at your leisure. So if we go to the next slide. So you're going to see this slide a few times, but I thought I would show it pretty early on, because this is really a snapshot of how the modeling is structured. So we have a reference scenario, and that is the topic that we've been discussing in all of the forums that I've mentioned, and is really the starting point for the analysis. And once the reference scenario that goes from now until 2050 and looks at how we can meet our decarbonization objectives, once that scenario is set, and I'll talk a little bit about more of how that's done shortly, but once that's set, what we do is compare the reference to alternative scenarios. So we ask questions like, what happens if we don't achieve the levels of energy efficiency or electrification that we said in the reference? Or what if it takes longer to build transmission? What does that mean? And so we'll do this comparison between the reference and the other scenarios. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail now about what goes into that picture that I just showed you, what goes into the modeling approach. I think it's really important to understand how the modeling is structured first, and then we'll move on to kind of how the working groups discussed the inputs into the reference scenario and into the model, and we can highlight where we landed in some key areas. So if we go to the next slide, so again, I'm going to take it back to the bill and just bring us back to House Bill 3630 and the criteria that the bill tells us the energy strategy needs to take into account. And so, as I've already said, the energy strategy is meant to evaluate pathways to meeting our energy policy objectives. And we have identified, and you won't see this on the slide, but we've identified 3 anchor policies that together are driving investments across the energy sector. We have an economy-wide target of 80% greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2050. We have an emission reduction standard for 100% for electricity by 2040 for our electric investor-owned utilities. And we have a 90% greenhouse gas reduction goal by 2050 under the Clean Fuels Program. And in addition to these goals, the bill asks us to take into account all of these criteria in considering how we meet those anchor policies. And so on the left, you can see you have essentially the whole energy sector, everything from energy demands and what we can expect the evolution of energy demand to be over time, all of the different energy resources and technology choices, including energy efficiency, both supply and demand side resources that we can consider to help us meet our goals. We also have all of the infrastructure for generation, for transmission, for distribution, and there are some interesting emerging technologies, and there are questions about what role those will play. And then there's also a series of really important considerations. So we're looking at what how to incorporate environmental justice considerations into our thinking and into our analysis, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. Also looking at understanding community benefits, land use considerations, energy burden and affordability. We'll be looking at employment impacts and economic impacts, energy security and impacts of broader markets, energy resilience, and community energy resilience. So it's quite a tall order, and we're going to talk you through how the modeling is structured to incorporate these points and inform the policy discussions. So if we go to the next slide. So again, you've already seen this slide, and what I want to point out here is to emphasize where the greatest value really is of the analysis, the way that it's structured. So the reference scenario, to give a little more detail, it looks at an aggressive but achievable trajectory to meet our climate and energy goals. That includes significant levels of electrification of transportation and end uses, energy efficiency, and demand response. And then each of the 5 scenarios changes something. So if you've ever seen the movie The Matrix, they've changed something, right? When like the deja vu happens with the black cat. So we're changing something in each of these scenarios. And you'll hear more later, but I'll just give a couple of examples. So what if we don't electrify to that aggressive but achievable level in the reference scenario? What does that mean? What mix of electricity and direct use fuels steps in? What does this mean for overall system costs? So the learning is not in proving that one scenario is going to be the future or is superior to another. It's really in learning about the delta, the little orange triangle that you see, and understanding what different risks might mean and how that can inform policy direction and policy discussions. We go to the next slide. So how are decisions made in this whole process? So first, I think it's important to emphasize that some decisions are baked into the model. So for example, we have to meet our state energy objectives, including greenhouse gas emissions goals. The bill tells us that. That's what the bill asks us to do. We also want to ensure a reliable energy system. So the model won't solve for an energy system where you just don't have enough energy to meet demand. It's not an option. And we also built in key existing laws and policies, such as the Clean Fuels Program or Advanced Clean Cars 2, to make sure that those are met kind of at the pace that's set in those policies. And then we've built in a number of assumptions around levels, as I've mentioned, of efficiency, electrification, and flexibility. And the reason for this is that we know, based on numerous other studies, that these are keys to a least cost path to meeting energy and climate policy objectives. And we have that constraint that we have to meet our objectives in this exercise. And we realize that we're needing to ramp up these levels beyond where we are today. And so what we're doing is setting these pretty aggressive assumptions, aggressive but achievable assumptions out to 2050. And then we're going to pair these with scenarios where we don't manage to achieve those levels of electrification, of efficiency, of flexibility, to understand what happens and what their value is in Oregon. And finally, we focused strongly on making sure that we're using the best, most up-to-date, and most Oregon and region-specific data whenever possible. And we're focused on making sure that the modeling informs policy discussions, and really that while we have this long-term outlook, that we're understanding kind of what the next step needs to be and what the policy recommendations might be to help us get there. So if we go to the next slide, I also want to talk a little bit about what the analysis does and doesn't do, since we've noticed in the working groups and in discussions that everybody has a different starting point, and it's helpful to just lay this out really clearly. So starting with what it does do, first of all, it does what the bill asks us to do. It develops pathways to achieving our energy policy objectives. These policies cut across the whole economy. So they cut across electricity, transportation, and direct use fuels. And the model integrates electricity sector and fuel supply for an economy-wide perspective. So we get to learn what happens between those sectors to reach our goals. And this is a little different from what you may have seen in other analyses that focus on just one sector, like electricity, for example. We're also creating complementary analyses that look at co-benefits and costs of different pathways on equity, on environmental justice, on land use, jobs, and air quality and public health. So what the model does not do is almost as important as what it does do to understanding it. We're not forecasting the future. We're modeling out to 2050 to understand what near-term decisions are needed to navigate uncertainty. But as I already said earlier, none of these circles, they're round, but they're not meant to be a crystal ball. The analysis does not serve the same purpose as utility integrated resource plans, which some folks might be more familiar with. It's not a least cost planning tool that leads to a concrete investment strategy. It's a mechanism to understand economy-wide decarbonization options and interactions between sectors and their implications to inform policy. And along those lines, we're not focusing on any single utility service territory. This is a statewide model. And finally, it's not a transmission planning model. I said finally, but I have one more point, which is we're not providing location-specific outputs or results for resources or transmission lines. So we won't be able to tell you whether something will or will not be built in like on a particular field in your community, for example. So if we go to the next slide, we're getting really close to getting really concrete with you on where we've landed with all of this. So this is a high-level peek under the hood of how the model sees the world. It starts with a model of Oregon's economy, residential sector, how do homes use energy, how do commercial facilities use energy, industry, transportation, and then it looks at how we meet that demand, how we power our economy. And we take into account all of the criteria that I've already mentioned here on the right. And all of this is meant to help inform the pros and cons of, or the costs and benefits, I should say, of different pathways to inform policy discussions. And I'm gonna hand the mic over to my colleague, Joni, to dig a little bit deeper into how the model works. Joni.
Thanks, Edith, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joni Sliger. I'm the Senior Clean Electricity and Markets Analyst here at Odo. The next few slides, as Edith said, are going to be a little more detailed, a little more technical. They'll provide a high-level summary of how the technical consultant's energy modeling works. As Edith mentioned, Odo contracted the Clean Energy Transition Institute to perform this technical modeling, and their team involves Evolved Energy Research. So you might hear us refer to the energy model here simply as evolved model. And on that note, before diving in here, I want to recognize we're going to get into a little bit of the details here, but not as many as details as our consultants have presented on in the last few months. So we've been having a lot of stakeholder meetings, and those are recorded and up on our website. So if you want to learn more about how the model works, I'd encourage you to check those out. But with that, let's dive in here. So this is a visual from Evolved showing the steps the modeling takes and the inputs that go into the model. The middle row is pretty similar to the graphic Edith just showed you. We can see the model starts with kind of a baseline or snapshot view of the economy today, and it then estimates how the economy will grow or change over the coming decades. That provides an estimate for the model of the total energy demand across the economy. And the model then considers that projection of energy demand, and it runs calculations for how best to meet that demand so that it can provide a supply portfolio that is the least cost option for decarbonizing and meeting our goals while still maintaining a reliable energy system. So to sum up this middle row, the model is projecting future energy demand and then calculating a reliable and least cost energy supply to meet that demand. Nice little two-step. But the model, it doesn't just come up with these numbers. We have to feed it data. That's what the bottom row is about. So the principle our consultants and we are following here is using the best available data to inform both the model's calculations on the demand side and on the supply side. Like Edith mentioned, Evolve's model, it starts with high caliber national data sets. That's what they've used in the past. That's data sets such as from the National Renewable Energy Lab. And in the past few months, we've been meeting with stakeholders to identify even higher quality data sets that are more Oregon and focused on the West. And then finally, the top row going up there, you can note that's where we give the model certain assumptions for the scenarios that we want to run. These assumptions include things like how many electric vehicles might be sold by a given year, or how soon could we build a new transmission line. Those aren't things we know or that we have specific data of knowing what's going to come out, but that gives some examples of the sort of assumptions that Edith is going to discuss later on today about some potential alternative scenarios. But I think it's helpful for this slide to just understand that those assumptions that we test through alternative scenarios, those are things that are built directly into the model. So next slide, please. Thank you. And here we get a little more detail just on that first step on the demand calculations. So the data going into the model is for approximately 80 different demand subsectors. And some of the large ones are listed on this slide, such as how much air conditioning will be installed in homes. These are things there's some significant uncertainties about in the future. We don't know exactly what is going to be the increase in electricity demand due to electrification. We don't know how many EVs will be sold. That depends on consumer behavior and choices. And we don't know how many new data centers might appear in the system. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's certainly something we've discussed, but recognize that the model is relying on data that has inherent uncertainties in some ways. And I will pass to Michael Friels to talk more about other aspects of the model. Thank you.
Thank you, Joni. So again, my name is Michael Friels. I'm a policy analyst at Oregon Department of Energy, and I'll continue the conversation talking about kind of the model and how it works. And specifically in this slide, we're going to talk about electricity and fuels. So once the first model identifies the total energy need for Oregon's economy, what Joni was just speaking to, the second model will consider the different resource options for meeting that demand. So like natural gas, rooftop solar, or a new resource such as offshore wind facilities or hydrogen fuel. So some of these resources we need, such as electricity generation facilities or natural gas pipelines, already exist in Oregon and already being operated by Oregon's utilities today. And there may be opportunities to enhance existing facilities by adding energy storage or incorporating low carbon alternative fuels. But additional generation, transmission, and distribution facilities will need to be built to meet our evolving needs between now and 2050. The model will consider the likely cost to build and operate those facilities, compare the options with using both the cost information and other factors like when those facilities could be built and available to produce energy. And so the model considers all of this information and develops a portfolio of resources that can be expected to meet Oregon's energy demands reliably and at least cost. So if we go to the next slide, we'll look at the geography of the model. So the model does not consider Oregon in a vacuum. It considers Oregon within the larger context of the Western United States. So Oregon is in competition with other states for energy resources. Today, electricity, natural gas, gasoline, and other energy resources are bought and imported into Oregon from other states. And resources created here in Oregon, like electricity from our dams, are also exported to other states. And this movement of energy and resources will continue into the future. We want to make sure it's important that the model reflects that going forward within the larger kind of energy economy of the Western United States. So the model itself is not a complex transmission nodal model. So each state is modeled as a zone, and there's a constraint in the model for how much transmission is available from one zone to another, so from different states or different locations. So Oregon is modeled as two zones, an east and west version, to demonstrate the substantial transmission constraints across the Cascade Mountains between the west side of the state and the east side of the state. The model also includes assumptions about the availability and cost of transmission infrastructure and compares resources in one zone against those in another zone. So I'm now going to hand you off to Ida to talk about the reference scenario.
Thanks, Michael. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to recap everything you've heard up until now, which is that we're kind of combining process and we've combined process with how the model is designed. And so for the reference scenario, we've really been looking in our engagements to ensure that we have the best data to develop an Oregon-specific database using best available resources to inform it. And then we've been talking about the assumptions and refining those assumptions with public partners to make sure that we get buy-in into how those are being set, at what levels, and understand different perspectives on why a certain assumption might be different. And then we've also collected a lot of feedback on alternative scenarios on these kind of key questions about the kind of risk factors or uncertainties or potential things that might happen that are different from the reference that we want to test. And so and now we're going to kind of dive in more into the discussions that we've had throughout the summer in the working groups. So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to start with a snapshot of how the reference scenario is captured in one document. So we have a document online that you can access. There's a link at the bottom of this slide, and I'm sure someone can paste a link in the chat if they haven't already. And there are just kind of these big tables that provide a list of key assumptions. So you can see here on the left, for example, that going back to that point I made about aggressive but achievable assumptions for electrification and energy efficiency, you can see for this top one, residential space heating, we reflect there a a share of heat pump sales by 2040 that's quite high, but we also consider to be achievable. And on the right side here, you can see for transportation, the different data sources that we used to kind of populate the model with information on, well, how many cars do we have right now, and how many trucks, and what can we expect over time. So you can access this online. This is not a working group, and so we're not going to go into the level of detail that the working groups did, but both this document and the working group meetings and their recordings and presentations are all available on our website. So if we go to the next slide, I'm now going to dive into what we discussed in the working groups and just extract some of the highlights and give you a flavor of the kinds of assumptions that we discussed and where we landed. So we had a couple of groups covering energy efficiency. One was one dedicated to energy efficiency and another that focused more on buildings. And then load flexibility was covered as well in the energy efficiency group. And so you can see here that we highlight a few key topics that we discussed in more depth in those groups. So there was quite a lot of discussion around the potential for weatherizing buildings and the level of energy savings to expect from weatherization. We also discussed about how to define those aggressive but achievable rates of adoption for electric and hybrid heat pumps. And the way that that assumption is framed is by sales share. So essentially in a given year into the future, when people go to buy a heater, what percentage of those purchases are purchases of technologies or of devices that incorporate electric and hybrid heat pump technologies. And then we also had a discussion around how much demand response we might expect from different end uses, including different electric loads like heat pump, water heaters or electric water heaters, electric vehicles, and batteries. So I'll just give a quick sense of where we landed in a couple of places just to illustrate what you would see if you went into that more detailed document. So for residential and commercial space heating, as I said, we set the assumption in the form of sales shares of electric heat pump and other technologies. For residential space heating, the targets represent the sales share of electric and hybrid heat pumps over time. I shouldn't say targets, the assumptions that we built in. And essentially, what percentage of new heaters that people buy for their homes are electric and hybrid heat pump technologies in given years. For residential and commercial space heating and hot water heating, we discussed different opportunities and barriers to achieving those high sales shares. And that led us in some cases to lowering some of the sales share numbers when we took into consideration some of the barriers and some of the difficulties in achieving those high levels of ambition. And for this group, I'd also point to levels of flexibility that we've included in the reference scenario. So we assume flexibility from vehicles as well as from appliances. For vehicles, that's incorporated in the form of managed charging. So essentially charging your car at different times. So for electric vehicles, we assume that 2/3 of electric vehicles participate in managed charging by 2030. And for commercial electric vehicles, we have a lower participation rate because those vehicles often have to run a lot more hours than your average household car. And so just 1/3 of commercial electric vehicles participate in managed charging by 2030. And we also assumed that half of household and commercial facilities participate in some form of firm demand response. And so, for example, hot water heaters sold in Oregon have to be demand response ready. And so as those hot water heaters are bought up, there's an opportunity there to kind of deploy those to shift when water is being heated. And so we assume that half of households are participating either with their hot water heater or with another technology in some kind of virtual power plant or other demand response program. Michael, I'm going to hand it off to you to talk about transportation.
Thank you, Edith. Hello, everybody again. So for modeling transportation in the reference scenario, we focused on assumptions around what type of vehicles are driven in Oregon, how much they drive, and how they are fueled. So to decarbonize this sector, we know there'll be a big shift into electrification, including both battery electric vehicles and potentially hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. But not every sector will be able to electrify at the same pace or at all. So there will be a role for low carbon fuels like renewable diesel, renewable natural gas, sustainable aviation fuels, and ammonia. And there are other ways to decarbonize transportation as well, like shifting to other transportation options like walking, biking, or transit. The Transportation Working Group discussed assumptions around this rate of electrification, as well as the role of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and low carbon fuels and reducing the amount that people could drive within Oregon over time. And in particular, we focused on areas not yet covered by existing policy. So for example, for light duty vehicles, Oregon's Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation requires that 100% of light duty vehicle sales are zero emission vehicles by 2035. Similarly, on the medium and heavy duty side, advanced clean trucks require an increasing percentage of medium and heavy duty vehicles to be zero emission vehicles. But this policy only goes out to 2035 and does not get us to 100% electrification. And we know that we must get there to meet our economy-wide climate goals to account for other areas of the economy that are much harder to electrify and therefore harder to decarbonize. So much of the discussion in the working group was around what year to assume that these vehicles will reach 100% sales of zero emission vehicles. And ultimately, the group settled on, for school and transit buses, assume 100% of new sales are ZEVs, or zero emission vehicles, by 2036. And for long haul trucking, make the assumption that 100% of new sales are zero emission vehicles by 2040. There was not always agreement on this or consensus. Many felt the initial targets we proposed were too aggressive, given the many barriers to electrification for this sector. And so we did push back the initial target years to reflect that conversation and to demonstrate that we heard what the recommendations were from industry and other public partners. And another discussion was around vehicle miles traveled. So we discussed whether to assume vehicle miles traveled per capita remains flat out to 2050 in our reference scenario. This would reflect historical trends up to this point, and whether to include existing policy targets of a 20% reduction in vehicle miles traveled per capita by 2050. The group also decided to include existing targets in reference and then test what happens if vehicle miles traveled reductions are higher or lower than expected. So this will give us the opportunity to kind of highlight the value of vehicle miles traveled reduction investments, such as funding for transit or active transportation. This also helps us understand the changes in vehicle miles traveled impact to overall energy demand for the economy wide and therefore the cost of decarbonization. So now I'm going to hand you off to Joni.
Thank you, Michael. So I'm going to switch us over a little bit, stepping from that demand side of the model over to the supply side, with a discussion of another stakeholder working group we had that was focused on electricity generation technologies. This includes things like rooftop solar, offshore wind. In our meeting, we discussed some different electricity resource options that the model should consider, such as biomass and the value of it in the context of Oregon's timber basket. I'm not going to list all of those out. You can see the full list of options in the reference scenario document that's online. But another item I want to share from the discussion we had, this is not a comprehensive list, of course, but we had a discussion also on one of the big drivers for new energy development, back to the demand side, which is the addition of new data center loads. As I mentioned earlier, this is a big topic right now with a lot of uncertainty about it. And so we discussed that, and based on stakeholder feedback we got in the group and in comments, we're looking at modeling in the reference scenario a higher forecast of data center load growth than you may have initially seen when we posted our draft reference scenario. We think this higher forecast is still consistent with the aggressive but achievable approach we are taking in the reference scenario overall. But that was a fairly not quite consensus, but there was a strong feeling among stakeholder feedback we got that we should incorporate the higher forecast. So that's what we're doing. Can I get to the next slide, please? Thank you. I'm also going to talk about another working group we had that focused on transmission and distribution. That's the wires and pipes that connect our electric and gas generation facilities to our loads like homes and offices. One of the important points that this group discussed is just, as Edith mentioned earlier, that the Oregon Energy Strategy really is meaningfully different from utility plans, and it's important to recognize that, to understand how it works. while transmission and distribution are really important components in our shared energy system, the energy strategy is at a much higher scale than utility plans you may have heard about in other contexts. And to be clear, both types of planning are very important as we work towards a reliable future. Also on the slide here, you can see some of highlights of some of the other feedback we received. Another big uncertainty that we face is how soon new transmission lines might get built. Based on stakeholder input, the reference scenario you can see online includes a list of specific transmission projects that are fairly advanced in their development, and we can expect them to reasonably come operational by 2025, 2030, or 2035. You can see the names online. But generally speaking, the model is assuming that no new interzonal transmission is going to be possible to be built and operational until 2035 at the earliest. This assumption really reflects that building new transmission takes a sometimes considerable amount of time, and brand new transmission projects are not something that it would be reasonable for the model to assume would be available in the short term. With that, I think I'll pass back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Joni. So I'm going to talk about the direct use fuels and industry working group that we convened. So this group was tasked with providing expertise on fuel and technology options that can meet future heating and industrial energy needs while achieving state decarbonization targets. So direct use fuels are fuels in buildings and industry, but do not include the fuels we use for transportation or electricity generation. So in Oregon, the most consumed direct use fuels include natural gas, biomass, heating oil, and other petroleum fuels. Our direct use fuels and industry working group evaluated how we could decarbonize these fuels through electrification, clean fuels growth, and the efficiency improvements needed to meet future demand of buildings and industry in Oregon. So industrial high heat applications will likely need to transition to low carbon fuels like renewable hydrogen, ammonia, renewable natural gas, or other biofuels. We discussed Oregon's dependence on regional and national fuel production of alternative fuels, and the cost to produce and distribute these fuels, and how they'll impact the availability and the rate that they can be adopted within Oregon. Electrification is also likely to occur in buildings and low heat industrial applications where it's cost effective and feasible. So we discussed what are reasonable assumptions around the rate that electrification will be adopted by buildings and industry, and adjusted those rates based on the recommendations we received from the working group and public comment as well. So let's now move to our next slide and talk about the Land Use and Natural Resources Working Group. So this working group evaluated land use and natural resource screens to determine the feasibility of where new and long-lived energy resources could go in Oregon. We were attempting to answer how much can be developed and how much do we want to develop within Oregon. And it's important to understand kind of how the model looks at geography or looks at land use within Oregon. So it doesn't cite specific projects at specific locations in Oregon. I think Edith mentioned that early in the presentation. It really looks at the total availability of land for any development project. So the exercise wasn't necessarily to identify specific locations where sites should be located. Instead, we're determining how much of Oregon may be available for energy development as a whole, and screen out areas where we're less likely to cite energy development projects. So in part of that process, we evaluated the Nature Conservancy's Power Place West study and Oregon's Renewable Energy Siting Assessment tool to determine how we could create reasonable land use assumptions. In the end, the working group decided to restrict legally and administratively protected areas. This included national wildlife refuges, national parks, tribal lands, military training areas, critical habitat for endangered species, and many more. So this really aligns with the energy development we're seeing today. I do want to acknowledge that there are limited land use and natural resource inputs into the model. And these don't reflect all of the potential energy development impacts to Oregon communities and our natural areas. The analysis of the modeling results and policy recommendations in the next phase of the energy strategy development will be a better opportunity to dive greater into those details. So if we go to the next slide. So our environmental justice and equity working group met multiple times and used their opportunity within their time to kind of understand how the modeling process works and dive into the modeling inputs that were being discussed in many of the other working groups to really tease out what these inputs would do to kind of demonstrate the benefits and costs to environmental justice communities and what the situation would be in a variety of different energy transition scenarios. So this required digging into the modeling inputs to assess whether they can provide insight into issues like energy burden, disparities across geographic locations, homeowners and renters, rural and urban geographies, in general, just kind of access to clean energy technology and resources to make sure everybody gets the benefits and can share in some of the cost of many of these changes. So this group also wanted to understand the model's granularity to dig deeper into the specifics of the disparities, such as the effects on rural areas of the coast, in eastern or southern Oregon, and in rural areas of the Willamette Valley. And while digging into these conversations, we noted that there was uncertainty around the current disparities and a lot of concern around that they may not change in the energy transition. And so we're working to develop more opportunities to convene this group and kind of dive into those concerns. The Environmental Justice and Working Group will have another meeting, and it's coming up on October 9th. And there'll be an opportunity within that meeting to provide feedback on the energy wallet and air quality issues and some geospatial mapping analysis that will be incorporated within the modeling. So now I'll hand you over to Edith.
Thanks, Michael. And Michael just said a mouthful. And so this is kind of the slide that describes what that is, what we mean when we're talking about energy wallet, air quality modeling, employment effects. So there's a slide that I showed earlier that described kind of what the bill requires us to take into account. And there was this right-hand side that talked about environmental justice, and jobs and a number of other issues that the model doesn't necessarily get to, but it can inform. And so what this slide shows is are some additional pieces of analysis that we will be undertaking to better understand, interpret, and ultimately better apply the learnings from the modeling to inform policy discussions. And so this is structured, showing a bit of the flow. So we will start with the energy modeling results. So the model, as you've heard, calculates the energy needed to power our economy and looks at least cost ways to provide that energy, at the same time meeting our clean electricity and emissions goals and other energy policy objectives. But that least cost is sort of system-wide and doesn't get at the question of how do we ensure that everybody's brought along, how do we make sure that we're taking into account kind of how to structure policies to enable an equitable transition and an inclusive transition. So one of the tools that we are applying, kind of analytical tools to get at that question, is the concept of an energy wallet. And so essentially an energy wallet represents the energy spending and energy burden for different customers. And it includes imagine a household, you might be paying a certain amount a month for electricity, but then you also drive your car. And unless you have an electric car, a lot of us don't have an electric car, then you're also paying for gasoline. And then maybe for cooking and maybe even for heating, you're using natural gas. And so the energy wallet includes all of those costs in one wallet so that we can understand how much folks are paying. And the way that the energy wallet kind of analysis is going to be structured is by looking at 5 representative households across Oregon to understand how we might frame up those representative households to represent to the degree possible, to the highest degree possible, differences in the costs and the burden and just the structure of how different households are paying for electricity in an urban area, in a rural area, in a coastal area, for example. And so when Michael mentions this October meeting, that will be one of the topics of discussion. We also will have another modeling exercise. There's a model that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has developed that helps calculate changes in air quality coming out of a modeling exercise like what we're having that'll give us a mix of resources. And so we'll look at the differences in air quality, their improvements or not, of the different scenarios. And we will also be conducting a complementary analysis to understand the employment effects of the reference scenario and also the different scenarios to understand better what the energy transition might mean for jobs. And we'll eventually also be analyzing what it means for training needs and for workforce. And finally, you can see this box at the bottom that talks about geospatial mapping. So essentially, we are also with the Environmental Justice and Equity Working Group looking to see what data is available in kind of a geospatial format. So kind of looking at geography in Oregon on different vulnerabilities to understand kind of what some of the key vulnerabilities are throughout our state among different communities, and to help us interpret the energy modeling results, and again, to inform those policy discussions. And so the energy wallet and the air quality modeling and even the employment effects, all of those can be kind of better understood if we can understand what some of the kind of key differences are across our state geographically. If we go to the next slide, I think that's our last slide for the reference case. So we just ran you through the process that we've been through over the summer. We've run you through how the model is structured and what purpose it serves. We've talked about the value of those little deltas, those triangles between the reference case and the alternative scenarios. And we've given you an overview of the topics that the different working groups focused on. Some of the main highlights from those meetings, which again, if you want more, there were more topics discussed. We just extracted some of the main themes. You can go in and review the slides and the recordings from those. And now what I'd like to talk about is the piece that you all have not yet seen and that we have not yet presented because we've been working on it, which are the alternative scenarios. So throughout all of that engagement, we didn't just engage to inform the reference. We actually engaged throughout the summer to understand what people would like to learn from this project and from this analysis, and what would be most valuable to learn. And we were encouraging that those different ideas on what we can learn from the analysis be framed as what-if questions. So what if it took longer to build transmission? What if less energy efficiency were available? And so we've bundled together those what-if questions, evaluated them with our technical consultants to understand how we might structure alternative scenarios to learn as much as possible. And then we've come up essentially with this list of potential alternative scenarios that you see here on the left. And what I'd like to do is to first run through what they are, and then I'll run through one by one and describe sort of what that key change is in the alternative scenario compared to the reference, and what some of those what-if questions are that we think we'll be able to get at by framing the scenario in that way. And again, this is a draft, and so we're really looking forward to comments about these alternative scenarios, whether folks have an idea of how we might do something differently or have questions. We're really looking forward to getting some feedback here. And this is sort of equivalent to that second round with the reference, where we presented a draft reference and then we provided some space for feedback and then finalized it. We'll do the same with the alternatives. So we've talked about 5 scenarios. We've budgeted for 5 scenarios in this project. We've come up with 7. And so we're looking for feedback on all 7. And in the meantime, we're figuring out behind the scenes whether it's possible to do all 7, because perhaps perhaps it's doable. We're working on that part. So we have here lower energy efficiency and electrification as one alternative scenario, again, to be a contrast to the aggressive but achievable level in the reference scenario. We have a lower electrification of transportation alternative scenario, a lower demand response scenario. So that's all on the demand side. And then we also include, and this was one of the examples I gave earlier, constrained transmission. We also are really interested in testing constrained transmission plus constrained utility scale generation, and I'll talk about that shortly. We are looking to explore higher hydrogen availability and what that might mean for the mix of resources that help us meet our clean energy goals. And we also have discussed in the working groups, and so are putting here as well, what we could learn if we were to frame a more ambitious greenhouse gas emission reduction scenario where we go beyond that 80% economy-wide goal that we have. So if we go to the next slide. So the way that these slides are all going to be structured the same way. So I'll walk you through it once, and then you'll get into the swing of things as I go through. So the title is essentially the kind of the shorthand of what the scenario is. So this is lower energy efficiency and electrification in buildings. On the right, you have those what if questions that we are trying to get at with the scenario. I can't guarantee how we're going to answer these questions, but they seem like questions that the scenario would help inform our understanding of. And then on the left, in the kind of dark box, are the parameters that we're changing. So kind of what goes into that delta. What are we changing in this scenario that's different from the reference? And so I'm actually gonna I'll start with the box in this case. So what we're talking about doing is delaying the sales shares in households by 10 years for 2 technologies. Electric and hybrid heat pump space heating, and electric and hybrid heat pump water heating. So essentially we're keeping the same targets that are in the reference scenario, but or the same assumptions as the reference scenario, but we're then saying, well, but it's going to take 10 more years to reach that level of efficiency and electrification. And what does that mean? We'll do the same for the commercial sector. So again, for space heating and hot water heating, the sales shares that we have for electric and hybrid heat pumps, for space heating and electric hot water heating are delayed by 10 years. So it takes longer than in the reference. And then during those 10 years, the question is, what fills that gap? We also will plan to reduce the level of industrial electrification by half. I'll just remind everybody, I'm not showing all the numbers here because it's quite detailed, but online you can see the draft alternative scenarios in a document that lays out which numbers we're talking about and how we're proposing to change them. And then finally, we are reducing the improvement in industrial process efficiency from 1% to 0.5% per year. So this is our proposal of how we would frame up the difference between the reference and this alternative. And here are the questions that we think this would help us understand. So what if it takes longer to reach the levels of energy efficiency and electrification in the reference scenario? What if current levels of energy efficiency and electrification are maintained? So we're not exactly sure what that would look like. So we'll see how current levels would compare to that 10-year delay. There's some learning that needs to happen as we run through the process of running this alternative scenario. What if process-related energy efficiency in industrial sectors is slower than in the reference? And there's also a question that we've heard quite a bit is, do we rely more on alternative fuels to meet demand for space and water heating? And if so, what does that look like? So these are the kinds of questions that we think that this scenario can help us understand. And again, this is a draft, and so we're looking for your feedback on this framing. If we go to the next slide, so this slide is the constrained transmission scenario. Essentially what we are proposing to do is to, again, this is going to be a time delay. So we're proposing to delay greenfield transmission development until 2045 across the West. So we're not just doing this in Oregon, we're doing it across the West. And so essentially we're going from assuming that it takes 10 years to build new transmission in the reference to assuming that it'll take 20 years, which is kind of the high end of what we've been seeing out in the world. And the reason for focusing around the whole West is that this is a very real risk across the West. It's unlikely that this would just be a problem for Oregon. And so we want to understand what this very real risk would mean in terms of what it takes to meet our energy policy objectives. Within this, we plan to run the scenario allowing for reconductoring of existing lines. And so that is a bit of a release valve. So even if you can't build new lines, you can reconductor them and get more capacity out of transmission corridors that are already in place. And then we have, so that's the scenario. And then we have a couple of sensitivities, which are just like little levers that we'll pull to see what happens, because we also think that we might learn from doing that. So we have an additional sensitivity for transmission, which is, as Michael mentioned, Oregon is being modeled as an east and west zone for purposes of transmission. And that's because of the challenge to get electricity across the Cascades. And as we know, a lot of the load centers are west of the Cascades, but there are a lot of resources in Oregon and east of Oregon that would have to be brought in on those transmission lines. And so we'll test that additional sensitivity both in the reference scenario, so everything's the same except for this tiny lever, and we'll also test it in the constrained transmission scenario. And so what kind of questions do we think that this will help us understand? So first, what if it took longer to construct transmission across the West, including between Oregon and other states? What if east-west transmission expansion across the Cascades in Oregon was delayed? What if we had to rely only on reconductoring to meet transmission needs? That's also a question we've gotten in some of the groups. And what if we relied more on in-state resources? So part of what this scenario does is make it harder to bring resources into Oregon. And so we might see the model rely more on in-state resources. What does that look like? If we go to the next one, so in addition to constraining transmission, we thought that we would tighten the valve a bit more on the ability to build large scale stuff. And so we propose a scenario that both has all of the deep elements I just mentioned before. So it takes 20 years to build out transmission. Reconductoring is possible, but then we would also increase restrictions on where new utility scale projects could be built. So that would affect siting for both transmission, which is already delayed, and it would also affect siting for utility scale generation. And the way that we're proposing to structure that that restriction is by applying the Nature Conservancy's Power of Place West study and the level 3 restrictions that are applied there, which are quite a bit more restrictive than the reference, which, as Michael explained, applies levels 1 and 2 of that study. And so this scenario gets at a lot of questions that we received in the working groups. Such as, what if in addition to constrained transmission, utility scale renewable development was delayed? What if more restrictive land use protections were applied? What if we had to rely more strongly on distributed resources to meet our energy needs? So again, we don't know exactly what the model will tell us. And so, for example, on distributed resources, we'll have to see how much these restrictions kind of uncover those resources as a way to meet the kind of the shortfall of these other resources not being available. So there's a learning process here, but these are the questions that we're really curious about and that we've heard through our engagement that others are really curious about too. Just one more clarification here. As with the constrained transmission scenario, this scenario would also constrain siting across the West. And again, this is kind of the result of an assessment of the risks that we face. And the risk is not just that it's difficult to site utility scale generation in Oregon because of competing priorities to protect lands. It's an issue that's playing out all across our region. And so we're applying this constraint across the region as well. If we go to the next slide, we also have a scenario that includes that expands the amount of hydrogen, of green hydrogen that's available to the system. So in the reference scenario, we already include the Inflation Reduction Act incentives, which are really significant and really kind of bump up the competitiveness of hydrogen to where it's really neck and neck with a lot of other clean energy technologies. And so the focus here is less on reducing the cost, although these points are likely to also have an impact on reducing the costs. But the kind of big levers that are likely to expand hydrogen availability are to assume that hydrogen pipelines are in place sooner. And so rather than having them in place in 2035, we assume an accelerated timeline for development of those hydrogen pipelines, having them in place in 2030. And we also increase the rate of hydrogen supply chain infrastructure build compared to the reference scenario. And the second point is one that's being developed as we speak. So it's something that's going to require some work to sort out exactly kind of what the reference and what the alternative scenario will look like. But this is a really important lever that would make hydrogen more available. And the kinds of questions that that this structure can help us answer and that we're really interested in learning about are: what if the cost of green hydrogen was lower than expected? What if the hydrogen supply chain were built out more quickly? And what role could hydrogen play to support energy storage and power sector decarbonization if it was more available? So what happens if there's more of this resource? What does it change in the rest of the system? Again, the interesting thing about this analysis is we're looking across different sectors: electricity, transportation fuels, and direct use fuels. And so we should have insights across those three sectors as we pull these different levers. If we go to the next slide. What if there's a limited demand response? So I mentioned earlier that in the energy efficiency and load flexibility discussions, we talked about demand response and about what aggressive but achievable rates of demand response might look like. And so what we're doing in this scenario is saying, all right, those are aggressive and achievable levels, but what if we don't meet them? What if we don't do very much demand response? What does that mean? And what steps in essentially to provide that flexibility service that we're not getting with demand response? And so we are proposing to structure this scenario by reducing residential and commercial participation in firm demand response programs and setting it at a level of 5%. In the reference scenario, it's set at 50%. So this is quite a bit lower. We also lower the amount of residential electric vehicles that participate in managed charging by 2030, from 2/3 to just 20%. And we assume that no medium or heavy duty vehicles participate in managed charging. And finally, we include no vehicle to grid technologies. So in the reference case, we have a higher assumption of vehicle to grid participation, essentially where electric vehicles are feeding electrons from their batteries into the grid. And here we're saying none of that is happening. So the kinds of questions that this might help us understand are: what if demand response continued at roughly the levels seen today? What if we relied primarily on supply side solutions to integrate variable renewable resources and meet system peaks? And what if electrification happens, but new electric loads are not managed flexibly? So again, we're only pulling the demand response levers here, but we still have the reference case high levels of electrification. And so this is where this question comes from and why it's framed the way that it is. If we go to the next slide, and we're almost there with these. So what happens if we go for more aggressive greenhouse gas emissions reductions? So the suggestion is to apply the recommendation that came out of the Oregon Climate Action Council of a 90% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2050. So this comes from the Oregon Climate Action Roadmap to 2030, and there's a link at the bottom here of the slide. And essentially, what would this scenario give us? There have been proposals in the past to raise the level of ambition that we have for our state, and but there hasn't been any analysis to understand what that would mean. And so this scenario would serve to understand what it would take to achieve more aggressive greenhouse gas emission goals in Oregon. Where would additional greenhouse gas emission reductions need to come from? So we already are building in House Bill 2021 and the Climate Protection Program, which both have quite ambitious goals. And so across the economy, where would additional emissions reductions need to come from to meet this economy-wide goal? And are there additional investments in existing or new technologies that would be needed, and by when? So it's possible that when we set a greenhouse gas emissions reduction level that's that's higher than in the reference, that's more ambitious than in the reference, it could provide insights into things that perhaps we don't even need to reach for now, but if we were to set a higher level of ambition, we might need to reach for. So it would help us understand what those things might be. So if we go to the next slide, so that kind of concludes the part of the presentation where we talk about the alternative scenarios. And I just want to emphasize that this is something that we're really keen to get feedback on. We've tried very hard to incorporate the comments that we've received, and we've incorporated really quite a lot of questions that people were interested in exploring into these scenarios. We do have a limit of how many we can do, and so even with that limit, we have kind of 2 more in the list here that we've included, and we're really interested to hear your comments on you know, whether we're missing anything, whether you have any suggestions on how the scenario is framed, whether there are additional questions you think that we might be getting at with these scenarios, so we can add them to that list of what if questions. So the deadline for that is October 11th at 5 p.m. And just to give you a sense of what else is coming in this whole project and the bigger picture of developing the energy strategy, the modeling is taking place this fall, and that's why we've been up against some of these quite tight deadlines, including recognizing that October 11th deadline is also pretty soon. And again, that's kind of put there to enable the modeling to happen on a timeline that keeps us on track for the project as a whole. In early 2025, we'll be sharing out the modeling results from phase 1. And that's really going to help kick off those phase 2 policy discussions, where we go from what we learned in the modeling and the insights that we gleaned, what we learned from that additional analysis of the energy wallet, jobs impacts, air quality effects, and then kind of extract all of those learnings and apply them to the policy world and understand which policies we have, what might be missing, and what we might need to get us on track to meet our climate and energy goals, taking into account all of the risks, or many of the risks that we know are out there, and some of the big ones that we test out in these alternative scenarios. So I see Jessica just wrote a note in the chat. We're really happy to answer any questions or share any comments that you'd like to put in the chat. And so I'm going to stop talking and just give folks a moment to kind of reflect and consider whether there's anything that you'd like to share out in the comments box. Thanks a lot. And I'd also encourage my colleagues to jump up on the camera. We can collectively help answer questions since we cover different topic areas within the energy system. I'll also, just while people are reflecting, I realize that, and we've run into this in the past, we're just presenting this information for the first time, the piece on the alternative scenarios, and some of you all might be joining us for the first time, and this is like quite a lot of information that we've presented over the last hour and a half almost. So we'd also encourage you to continue to reflect and share any thoughts that you have on reflection through the comment portal. And I think the next slide actually has a link to that comment portal so that you all can see where to drop your notes to us.
Edith, I have a question from Sarah.
Yeah.
Sarah asks, will there be a co-benefits analysis that considers how different alternative scenarios impact natural resources and land and seascapes such as forests, fisheries, farms, etc.? Have natural resource dependent communities such as fishermen and farmers been active in the engagement process so far?
Thanks for the question. And I'm going to look to my colleague, Michael, who led the Natural Resources and Land Use Group to help us answer this question. It's a very good question.
Oh, thank you for the question, Sarah. We appreciate it. So within the, I guess I'll answer your second part of the question. Within that working group, the Land Use Natural Resources Working Group, we did try to have a variety of diverse opinions and people representing the marine environment. I don't think we had any particularly fishermen on the panel, but certainly organizations that represent those communities. And that's certainly something that we can talk more about going forward. Within the land use modeling, we were just basically looking at, what land was available. So we didn't really go into the details of kind of the impacts of fisheries or impact to the marine environment of energy development, but there'd be opportunity for us to do that kind of in the next phase, the second phase, and where we're talking about kind of the policy development and the technical analysis of what we're seeing within the modeling. So when you're asking about the co-benefits analysis, I think we will try to cover kind of a broadly kind of the impacts and concerns and costs to those environments. But I think that's going to be a challenge for us. So I would really encourage you to participate in that next phase and offer your opinions and offer some recommendations around that, because we're going to certainly look at for the energy development side and look at the opportunity there. We will try to work with our environmental justice and community members and see if we can make sure we show that comprehensive, I guess, impacts for communities and for the natural environment of energy development within those communities. And so I certainly want to identify that as a challenge and something we're going to work towards, but I would love your participation in that going forward to help us with that.
Thanks, Michael. And the only thing that I would add to your answer is that just a reminder that we'll also be, I think that there are some ancillary analyses that might be interesting. So we will be looking at jobs. And so some of, Sarah, what you're asking about could be informed by the jobs analysis. And we'll also be looking at workforce and economic development. So I also encourage participation in those discussions and kind of evaluation of what we see coming out of that analysis as well. I will just say while we're waiting for any additional questions that I can't get my husband to pay attention to me talking about this stuff for 5 minutes. So I really appreciate everybody joining us here for an hour and a half to listen to some pretty detailed stuff, and really appreciate all of the participation that we've had up until now. It has been really tight time-wise and I know that people have had to make an extra effort to share their comments with us. And we're asking for a little bit more of that kind of willingness to bear with us and to send us feedback on a relatively quick timeline. So just really appreciate that and appreciate that outside of my household, there are people interested in these things who we can talk to.
Edith, seeing as how we have not a ton of questions in the chat so far. Maybe we could see if people want to raise their hands. For instance, I see Pat has their hand raised, and we might open up the phone to them here in just a second. And Abby, if you can help us with that, that would be great. If there's anyone else that has clarifying questions and wants to raise their hand, if we have time, we can try to answer them. Abby, are you able to get Pat so they can open their, yep, there we go. I see Pat's live. Pat, what's your question?
Myself again. Thank you. Sorry, I reflexively hit the button. As someone who's followed this process from the beginning, I want to commend DOE and the team. I like the way you've structured the alternate scenarios. I think your process of getting to the reference scenario has been very careful. I like the way that you have structured some of the changes as delays in time. It makes it easier for people to understand as opposed to changing parameters. And I want to think more about the 7 scenarios, but off the top of my head, I really hope you can get all 7 of them done. I think they would all be valuable. So just thank you for that.
Thanks, Pat. Really appreciate that feedback. And appreciate your participation.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat or hands raised right now. But if you do have any clarifying questions, please feel free to raise your hand in the chat. You can do that by hovering over your name, and then you should be able to raise your hand there. Or, I'm sorry, at the bottom of your screen. I forgot that we're on WebEx. At the bottom of your screen, there's a hand.
So I'm clicking around here trying to find the chat. I'm not seeing any more questions. I think that if there are no more questions, I suggest that we close the webinar. We really appreciate people's time and don't want to hold you any longer than we have already. But I just want to say, really appreciate people joining. The recording of this webinar will be available online shortly, along with the PowerPoint presentation. And I'll just emphasize, I'm not sure that I ran through the full list of resources that should be available on the website. If they're not already up, they'll be up today. And that's the reference scenario with all of the updated numbers, the draft alternative scenarios, and we've also put up written comments that we've received. We've aggregated them and organized them so they're searchable by who submitted the comments. So those are also up so folks can you can see yourselves if you submitted a comment, and you can also see what others have submitted and get a sense of what we've been working with as we've been finalizing the reference and working on these draft alternative scenarios. So thanks a lot, and looking forward to any and all feedback by 5 p.m. on October 11th. Thanks a lot, everybody.